И мы начнем нашу сессию. Сессия сегодня посвящена оценке и импакт-инвестированиям. И я с гордостью хочу представить моих коллег Джейн Рисман и Веронику Олазабаль. Джейн Рисман – консультант по оценке, Вероника Олазабаль тоже как известный человек в мире оценки. Сейчас она руководит отделом по исследованиям и оценке в Фонде Рокфеллера. И коллеги сейчас на самом переднем крае оценки, где происходит попытка интеграции и поиска общего языка между миром оценки, который занимаются члены нашей ассоциации, и миром импакт-инвестиций. Как раз коллеги нам расскажут об этом. Их презентация будет на английском языке, но мы поделимся с вами презентацией на русском в ближайшее время. Кроме того, значит, если вы планируете слушать Веронику и Джейн Рисман на русском языке, с нами наш переводчик Владимир Дубровин, вам нужно внизу на панели справа от зеленой кнопки демонстрации экрана есть кнопка «Перевод», вам нужно выбрать русский канал. Okay. With this, the floor is yours, Jane and Veronica.
Many thanks, Natalia, and thank you for inviting us to present at your conference this week. As Natalia mentioned, my name is Veronica Olazabal, and I am here to share what we, myself and Jane, have learned over the last couple of years in working in this space of evaluation and impact investing. And so I'm going to start, and Jane and I will go back and forth to keep it a little bit lively. I want to make sure before we launch that the translation is correct, is on. Is that right, Natalia?
Yes, it is on. Коллеги, кто слышит переводчика, напишите, пожалуйста, плюс в чате. Yes, you can go on. Sorry.
Fantastic. And so the slides are going to be in English, but I believe Natalia will be sharing some of the detail in the chat. And so next slide, please. Great. So the purpose of our session today is to provide a perspective on how both the worlds of evaluation and impact investing are coming together. And so in order to get everybody on the same page, Jane and I are going to do a review of the landscape of impact investing and its approaches to measurement, including talking about a term that we discuss often in the impact investing space, which is impact measurement and management. And that is a term that's very synonymous with measurement and evaluation. And so the acronym is IMM, and we will say IMM a lot. And so it's helpful to know that. The second piece is we're going to talk then about the intersection between where evaluation and IMM come together, because we think that's very critical for evaluators that are interested in the impact investing space and for impact investors that are interested in measuring impact. And then we will discuss how the evaluators can actually contribute to strengthening IMM and combating what we call impact washing, and which we will talk about in the next slide. Jane, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. It's such a pleasure to be here today and wish so much we were together in person, but this is where we are. So, which comes to the question of why we are here in this session. And Veronica and I have contributed to a global handbook of impact investing and contributed a chapter about how important it is to prevent impact washing. And this is a term that is used quite a bit. It's really a term of art, and it really is sometimes called greenwashing, impact washing, rainbow washing, but it's making claims you're having impact without actually measuring and monitoring that you really are making the difference. And for that reason, we believe evaluators have a really important contribution to make in helping to strengthen the way that impact is being measured and monitored, or impact IMM, as Veronica said, impact measurement and management. So we're here because we really all believe that the private capital is a very important part of the solution, But in order to really be solving the problems, we need to make sure there is integrity about impact, and that we'd like there to be more alignment, and we're part of a growing consensus around how impact is measured and managed, even to the point of how is impact defined, which is being defined very differently by different players. So we're really here to talk about how to strengthen this field of impact measurement and management. I'm going to move slides now. So this is a bit outdated, but it tells the story that is not very different even today. It's very difficult to actually gather these numbers, and a colleague did so about 10 years ago, just to get a sense of why it's so important that the global capital markets are actually part of the solution in contributing to impact. And if you look at, for instance, the US budget, you see the gray bar. Now that's a very small budget and it's only one country, but it gives us a sense of how much a government budget is contributing to the economic affairs and the ability to make changes for society and the environment. There are global pension plans, which have 28 trillion, far more money are in pension plans than how much money is in a government budget, a very high net GDP government budget. The individuals who own quite a lot of money in the world are 42 trillion. Those are individuals. But let's look at the capital markets. It's 3/4 of the pie. 3/4 of the capital that is deployed is coming from global capital markets. So if we have very large problems for society and the environment, we need to mobilize the global capital markets to be part of the solution and not just part of the problem. And that is one reason we are very focused on shoring up the impact integrity, as many companies are claiming to do things to promote different kinds of energy and different ways of solving the wealth gap. We need to be involved in how is that impact measured and monitored and made authentic. So go now, Veronica. Maybe we could talk about what we mean by impact investing. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane. And so usually, we throw around this term impact investing, and unless you're an investor, you actually don't really have a sense of what this term means. And so we're going to spend a few moments talking about it. And I'm going to put on my investor hat because I work for the Rockefeller Foundation, as Natalia mentioned earlier, and we are a philanthropy that does impact investing. We do regular investing as well. And then we also do more charitable grant making. And so I'm going to speak from my own experience as an investor. And so an impact investing investment actually, well, let me take a step back. Impact investing was a term that was coined in 2008. And while there had already been other actors investing their dollars into what we call impact, it did not become formalized until a meeting that took place in Bellagio, Italy, through the Rockefeller Foundation, where we coined famously the term impact investing. And so what it means is they are investments that are made into companies, organizations, or funds with the intention, and the key word here is intention, to generate social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. And so in 2008, when the term was coined, it sounded great, but there had not been a lot of thought put into what does impact actually mean and how will we know it when we see it. And so we simultaneously at the Rockefeller Foundation made a couple of grant-making field-building investments into building out the infrastructure of impact investing. And so one of the organizations that we invested and built out and incubated was the Global Impact Investors Network, which is called the GIN, and we will talk about the GIN often. In fact, this definition was formulated by the GIN, and the sources of the presentation are there too, so that you could take a look at the background materials. We also formalized another organization called BLab, which was then a company that would then go out to systematize and institutionalize the Benefits Corporation, which is a social enterprise, essentially a company that is doing this work. And so an investor will invest in a social enterprise. And so that's what we mean when we talk about companies. Next slide, please. So another question that often comes up and that we often talk about and sometimes throw the words around after what is impact investing is, who are impact investors? And so as mentioned, impact investments are optimizing for both social and environmental alongside of financial performance. And there's a variety of types of investors that we talk about. But we usually separate the type of investor between what is called an individual investor and an institutional investor. So an individual investor is someone who is, in quotes, qualified to manage their own money in order to achieve their own personal financial goals. And they could be people like high net worth individuals like Jeff Bezos, Bill and Melinda Gates, well, Bill and then Melinda Gates, just other individuals out there, George Soros, who have enough capital to make their own investment as a sole individual investor. It also includes their family offices. So for example, different people that founded Google have Google. Google has a foundation mostly called google.org. Google, but these individuals, in addition, have their own wealth and they have family offices that manage their wealth. So they would also be called impact investors. And then there would be other asset owners. And then that would be different from an institutional investor, which is at a company, an institute. And that would include terms that we often, people and companies that we often talk about as fund managers, managers that are managing large sums of resources in service of a portfolio. We would call the development finance institutes that. And so the World Bank, for example, would be an institutional investor. We have in the US, and I'm not sure if you have in Russia, something called community development finance institutions called CDFIs, which focus on place-based investments. So they work at more of a city level. We also have private foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation would be an institutional investors, as well as pension funds and insurance companies such as TPG, such as Nuveen, which is an arm of another pension fund. And we have religious institutes and NGOs. The Catholic Church, for example, has invested a lot of resourcing into impact investing through known individuals such as the Pope and the Vatican. So they would all qualify as institutional investors. And so it's a broad range of who can be investing, and the infrastructure that's set up to help, I would say, guide investors on how their investments could be impact oriented are organizations such as the GIN, BLab. There are many others, including Tonic, which focuses less on the institutional investor, the way the GIN does, and focuses more on the individual investor. So there's a large number of entities very much supporting this space, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that is affecting or has affected the way we would measure and evaluate impact. Next slide, please, Jane. So in addition to there being a definition and there being different types of actors in the impact investing space, there's also different forms of impact investing. And often these terms are thrown around interchangeably, and they're nuanced with differences in the way their capital is being used therefore, the way the impact is being measured. So if you look to the left of the spectrum, you see traditional investing, which is the typical stock market type of investing. And those investors might be seeking financial returns regardless of their various different environmental, social, and governance factors. And that's, they talk a lot about ESG there because they're using a mechanism called ESG to be able to screen. So that would be like we are thinking about, as we move into the spectrum, we are thinking about an investment and we want to be able to know whether or not we can pick or choose ones that are doing good and having a lot of impact. And so it's very much in the left part focused on screening. However, as you move across the spectrum into responsible impact investing, where we're really using ESG to manage our portfolio versus just screening, and sustainable impact investing, where we're looking into sustainability factors and we're considering things like the carbon footprint, waste reduction, and gender equality across our supply chain. So we're looking for any signals that our investments could be in service to something good. And sometimes that's called positive screening, versus with responsible impact investing, we might be just picking investments that are doing knowable harm. So that would be negative screens. So these are terms that we're continuously using. But the interesting part about these terms is that we're still not talking about evaluation and we're still not talking about impact management. We're talking about screening for these things in our investment choices. And so then we actually move into thematic impact investing, which is actually what we are talking about today. And this is where the spectrum begins to shift a little bit away from just choosing, putting our money where we think impact is happening because of some signal in the market, and then just letting it go. Whereas in impact investing and impact management, we're actually then collecting data after the money is released and the investments are made, to be able to be sure that we are at least trying to get to the type of impact that the portfolio or the investment professes to be generating. And that's a really important difference between what the left part of the spectrum is doing to the right. And then we move into impact first investing, which is thinking about maximizing impact regardless of financial return. And so oftentimes in the impact investing space, we're having these conversations about how much impact should I be giving up for financial returns? How much financial return should I be giving up to try to get more impact? So we have these conversations in the thematic impact investing space, whereas in the impact first investing space, it doesn't matter how much we lose as long as we're generating good things in the world. And then finally, we have philanthropy, which is the other part of my portfolio, where we don't worry about financial returns at all. We just kind of give the money away and don't even track it because we're trying to use it for the purposes of making the world a better place. So these are terms that you will often hear. I hope that that was a useful walkthrough. I'm going to turn it back to Jane to talk to us about where we have come from. And she's going to start with a little bit of a walkthrough of a report that we did in 2016. So Jane, back over to you.
Thank you, Veronica. Those were a lot of terms. And one of the things that I hope is sinking in is that this whole field of working in impact investing as an evaluator requires us to become familiar with an entire language set, which might look very different than what we're experienced with working with government or NGO kind of actors. And so there is a lot of our energy that has gone into translating, which we'll talk a little bit about later on, not translating from one language to another from a semantic point of view, but from one language to another from a field point of view. The impact investing is a field, and it's a subfield of the finance field, which has a lot of different language systems. And not only does it have different language systems, it has different standards of evidence. And so this paper that Veronica and I co-authored, and it's available on the Rockefeller Foundation website, talks about what the state of the field looked like 5 years ago, with the idea of like, what is the trend? Where do we see things going? And we can talk about what the trends are again toward the end of this presentation. But what we noticed is that there really were 4 categories, and 2 of the categories were focusing very much on the output level. And there is 2 ways that many people monitor their investments just by looking at, by outputs, how many people have been affected or how many people have been reached. And we know in evaluation, we have moved very far down the logic chain to the outcome and the impact level. So we're talking about impact investing. Here's the irony. The language of impact in evaluation is usually some longer term, grander global change. But when we come to impact investing, impact is used extremely broadly to talk even about the output. How many people did you reach, without any verification that those people's lives have changed? So this article that we wrote, we call it a white paper, is actually categorizing what kinds of measurement practices were really at play and still are at play. And we are really interested in helping to strengthen the changes. So the 2 categories that Veronica and I noticed that were on the cutting edge was outcome studies, actually impact investors that were following the outcomes of their investments. And the second one was about market systems. Many of us believe, especially in the evaluation field, that you need to look at the system, not just the individuals who are affected by the system. And so these system analyses are another very important part of actually knowing whether you're having impact or not. And the system could be the supply chain. How strong is the supply chain? Or the system could actually be the ecosystem that affects the entire agricultural sector. So systems are smaller and they're broader, but without looking at the system factors, even the political economic system, the policies and the economic regulations, it's very difficult to be looking at impact. So that's our proposal in this paper, that we move away from the performance measures and just standards and moving into outcomes and systems analysis. So moving forward into, that was 5 years ago. The last 5 years have been incredibly productive for the field of measurement in impact investing. It's been so productive that we want to show you this table, which can make you feel very dizzy and it feels a bit chaotic. But in reality, Veronica and I have worked to categorize in a 2x2 table what the field looks like by 4 basic categories. And what is very important and notable, we're going to go from the left to the right again, is that the field has a lot of proprietary private market-based measurement systems that are not transparent to others, but that are ones that are commercial, that you pay for, and you can get a rating. And that is good on one hand in that there is a lot of methodology, but it's poor on the other hand because there's no comparability from one rating system to the other. There's not a consensus. It's almost a marketplace competing on who has better measurements. And so we are advocating, and there is a growing body of standard bearers that are saying, let's move over to the right side of this. Let's create a field of measurement that we've agreed upon. And but I say we, I mean large numbers of people who come together through different huddles or vetting sessions and review processes in order to actually understand what does consensus look like if we agree on what measurement ought to look like. And so we have now a situation where many different standard bearers, people and organizations, I should say really organizations responsible for setting up measurement systems that are all building on each other's work. So for instance, the Global Impact Investing Network is, as Veronica said, the set of metrics that are most widely used in impact investing. And when they were born in 2000, and I believe it was 2009, the very first set, it was a catalog and you could choose any metric you wanted. Last year, the IRIS Plus system, which is what the metric catalog was renamed to, the IRIS Plus, now says, here are core metrics. No matter what, if you're going to be measuring changes in gender equity, these are 5 measures that everybody should use. And they've made those measures based on research about what strategies lead to gender equity and the outcomes that one can realistically achieve. And so they also include at least one outcome, which might sound like a small victory for the people in the evaluation field, but it's a major victory for the impact measurement field to say it's no longer good enough to just measure outputs. We need to be measuring outcomes as well. So there's more we want to say in the next chart about any one of these things, but I would love for you to appreciate that there's a left side and right side. The left side is private, competitive, market-based. The right side is transparent and shared information across, and that people are building on each other's work. And if you look at the top of this, you now might recognize the language Veronica introduced. The top of the chart is about thematic and impact investing focus. It is the measurement systems when you have impact first or a particular theme that you want to measure. And the bottom of the chart are ESG. These are more about screening whether or not a company is actually intending to create positive impact. And you use that in determining whether or not that is a company to invest in or to support, but it is not, or to put into a portfolio, but it is not actually measuring changes after an investment is made. It is screening to make choices about your portfolio, but it's not following up and seeing what changes happen. So even though the right side here looks very, I'm going to go to this top quadrant, looks very busy, this is the promising future here where different groups are now saying, we're not going to compete on measurement systems. We're going to build out measurement systems together and build on each other's work. And we can see the expression, the proof is in the pudding. How do we know that this is really happening? We can start to see that every year the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, conducts a study to find out who is using what in the impact measurement space. And if we look at the percentages here in this column, we can see that a survey of impact investors showed that almost 3/4, 73%, are saying we are having impact. We have an intention to have impact because we have aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So that is the #1 leading way that companies are claiming they are impact actors. That doesn't mean, mind you, that they actually are using this measurement system to measure their SDGs, but that is they're identifying what SDGs they're intending to achieve. The next most popular, at close to half, is the IRIS Plus system that we just mentioned. So it is the most widely used way to measure impact. So if you want to become familiar with a measurement system, that is probably the go-to place. And it's online and it's free to use. It is considered to be an end-to-end system. There's lots of resources on there. And we do know that most people who say they use the IRIS Plus also supplement it with other measures. It's not the only thing they use. This number, even though it's only 1/3 at 32% for the impact management project, is actually one of the most profound changes that has happened. I encourage everybody to look up on the website, the impactmanagementproject.com, because they became a player maybe less than 4 years ago in the global scene and gathered a global consensus and held many, over a 2-year period. They held many meetings of civil society, of pension funds, of investors, of evaluators, of many different financial actors to say, can we define impact? Can we agree on a definition of impact? And they agreed on 5 dimensions of impact. And that is profound, because now if we use the term impact, we know that it has the concept of who are you impacting? What are you impacting? How much are you impacting? What is your contribution, your additionality? Why do you make a difference that wouldn't otherwise happen? And the last category is, what's the risk? What's the risk that you're not going to have a good impact and possibly have a bad impact? A positive or negative impact are both impacts, and intended or unintended are both impacts. So the fact that this group became a project that's now sunsetting, it is going away. It came on the scene to say, come on, folks, let's get together. Let's agree on some things. And they brought big players together and small actors and brought everyone to open tables to come up with some consensus. And this is called the impactmanagementproject.com. And it is now, as you'll see in a moment, a very important part of many other systems. This last one is the IFC, which is a DFI, and it actually came out with 18%, even though it is a small number. They came out with 9 principles. 20% of the field doing any one thing is a big share of the field. It's a big market share. And their principles go further than others have gone before. And they lay out things like, you need to have a theory of change. They might call it impact objectives, but we call it theory of change. And they would say things like, you need to have verification, that you need to have an independent party come in and verify that you have processes for impact. So these are some very promising actors on the scene who are affecting the entire field. And we wanted to point out to you how much the field has actually changed. Now, another very thick chart, and hopefully when Natalia translates these slides, and I sent it to the wrong email address, so unfortunately she did not have them ahead of time, but now she does, and she will make them available to you. A very thick slide here, but these categories, again, evaluators love categories and frameworks. Let's face it, we try to organize the world so it's accessible and we can actually figure out what measurement looks like. We're building a field, and a field needs many parts to it. So it needs principles, and it needs larger frameworks, and it needs tools for infrastructure, and it needs some accountability. And so when we showed you the chart before and other aspects of impact measurement and management, they're not all talking at the same level. So some of the things we're talking about are guiding principles, like the IFC operating principles. They're very high level. And some things are frameworks. They're actually, like the Sustainable Development Goals, are categories or frameworks to be aspiring to, or the 5 dimensions of impact from the Impact Management Project. They don't actually have any tools, they tell you the framework, in which case we need a tool like Iris Plus, which are the metrics, or 60 decibels, which is a data collection methodology, or Tonic Tracer, which is how to track your data on a platform. And the last category is disclosure and reporting, or what are the standards for actually verifying that your measurement system is actually in place so that you can authentically measure. So this is not something I expect you to absorb right at this moment, but these 4 categories actually are being used by the United Nations for any organization that wants to claim that they are doing an SDG, like SDG 2 or SDG 5, something about poverty, something about hunger, something about cities. Anyone who wants to claim that, this is the framework that the UN SDG impact standards has created to help you see that there are principles, frameworks, tools, and disclosure, and that to build out your evaluation system or your IMM system, you need to be working within each of these 4 categories. I'm going to turn it over to Veronica now.
But if I could just jump in, Jane, can you go back one slide just to
Sure.
just to emphasize your point. So oftentimes when we get to so one of the questions that I usually get is, how is the Rockefeller Foundation managing its impact investing? What should we be doing? Do you have a methodology? So I get these questions a lot. And so as someone who studies the space, but then also gets to act within it, I wanted to share what I usually say. So I usually signal that you have to have a couple of like must-haves. And there's a lot of diversity, as Jane was speaking to, but you must have some type of framework that you're working against. You must have a few tools, and you must have some mechanism for validation. And oftentimes what I hear others have is they work with 60 decibels, which is a tool. And so therefore they must be managing their impact. Or they are using ESG, which is part of the Global Reporting Initiative, to screen. Therefore, they are managing their impact. And so the point that Jane raised of you should probably, it doesn't actually matter, because you might be working with an investment group that is very large, like a development finance institute, or you might be working with a social enterprise. A tool is not going to all of a sudden allow you to do many things. And looking at it that unidimensionally actually increases the probability that you are going to be where we started, which is impact washing. And so what we're trying to do from the evaluation perspective and from the IMM, the impact management and measurement and management perspective, is try to discipline us and try to introduce a discipline so that we are ensuring that we're not just speaking about the one SDG and putting that sticker on our website, or speaking about only the positive results and the positive impacts, because we know that that history has shown us that oftentimes good intention actually turns bad and creates more bad than good. And so when we're thinking about evaluating it, and that's going to be our next section, we're thinking about ensuring that there is some kind of principles that we are adhering to, that leads us to some frameworks that enables us to pick the right tools, and then that we're at least being transparent about it through disclosure and reporting. So I wanted to provide that example because oftentimes it can be very overwhelming to hear different words and different tools and different frameworks, but hopefully you have a better sense of how to make sense of all of those various different words and lexicon that you hear. Next slide, please, Jane. So we're going to move to the next part of our discussion, which is, now that you have a sense of what the definitions are in terms of what an impact investment is and who they are and what types of investments there are, and you have a sense of the history of the way the impact measurement work and discussion has evolved and where it is today, we're now going to talk a little bit around, so what does evaluation have to do with this all? How does evaluation create value to impact investing? And so in 2014, the Rockefeller Foundation asked this question and worked with a couple of consultants, Edward Jackson and Karim Harji, to be able to think analytically and robustly and deeply and systematically to try to answer this question. And they wanted to do that in service to field building and also to add some practical tools for an institution. Because remember, in 2016, Jane talked about a paper that we wrote. We basically concluded we were heading down an impact washing journey and pathway because everyone was thinking really about outputs. There was a lot of fragmentation of tools. Essentially, if you were an impact investor and you said you wanted to measure your impact, you would just create it. There was no one was learning or leveraging from others because it's such a competitive market at the same time. And so right around 2014, we started asking this question about how we can become more purposeful and sophisticated about the impact part of the impact investing. And at the same time, there was a demand that was growing for actual evaluation of impact investing. And so there was this sense of there's limited demand and there's limited supply, but at the same time, it felt like an opportunity. There was some demand, and that demand didn't really have a supply. There were not that many evaluators out there that could talk to you about this work in the way Jane and I can talk to you about it today. So there was a lack of supply. And so when that happens, you get a new person demanding a service, for example, an investor, and they go to an evaluator. The evaluator has primarily worked with government, and so they have certain assumptions about the way the world works. Like, for example, change takes a really long time, which we all know is true. We should be, we need to have let an investment play out for a long period of time in order to be able to see something. We did have the camp around developmental evaluation, which was a little bit of a turning point for both the regular traditional evaluation pathway as well as for the impact investing pathway. But developmental evaluation sounded too technical. Really, the investor just wanted to know what it was their impact. And couldn't it just be a set of metrics that you could quantify? And there was a sense of oversimplification. So there was a misalignment in terms of the demand for evaluation from the impact investing side and the evaluation products and services. And so this paper was aimed to try to gather a little bit of an alignment around, well, what is applicable? What is right sized? What could be applied to this new space that has already emerged from the evaluation space? And essentially, it concluded a couple of things that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. But one of the conclusions was that evaluators, in order to meet the new demand for the new funders and investors, needed to tool up. We needed to not create something completely new, but really right size our tools to and figure out what the right sized application was for impact investing. We couldn't take our paradigms of how we thought change works that we've learned in government sector and apply it to private sector or impact investing. And so next slide, please. What we concluded there was that there were some transferable skills, and there were really helpful tools that we could transfer, and they needed to be retooled a little bit, but it wasn't completely a blank slate. So one of those two transferable skills was the theory of change, for example, and we'll talk a little bit about where and how we can apply theory of change within the investment, the impact investment life cycle, which is pretty critical. Another one was that we talk about in the evaluation space is evaluative thinking, asking questions about how change is happening, asking questions that helps unpack some of the assumptions that are happening within the impact investing life cycle was going to be really key to how we add value. Another set would be applying our methodological designs and tools, or our analytical skills, or even the way that we communicate data, and the way that we in the philanthropic space particularly apply strategic and emerging learning to our overall pipeline of work. All of that could be transferred, but not a one-to-one. It needed to be readjusted a bit further. Next slide, please. So over to Jane to talk a little bit about how theory of change then becomes applicable for an impact investing space.
Okay, well, the shock of my life is when I went to an impact investing conference and I heard impact investors use the term theory of change just as much as I would hear it in an evaluation conference. And I was absolutely delighted. And it's not a huge surprise because impact investors come up with the financial thesis. They believe that this is the financial performance that they can expect out of an investment. And they do a very thorough job analyzing that and anticipating that. And then they make the bet, they put their money down on what they think is going to be a good financial return. Well, the analog, the comparison to that is on the impact side is the impact thesis. So sometimes you'll see the word impact thesis. Often you'll see the word theory of change. And theory of change is accepted as like, what is our objective here? And it can apply at many different levels. It can apply to the industry as a whole about what's the theory of change and what does the industry need in order to transform and be disrupted. It could apply to particular funds, just a group of funds. What is the theory of change for these funds? And what is it we're trying to achieve in that right now? I'm evaluating a fund that is about guaranteeing the debt in order to lend money to communities that would not otherwise receive money. And their theory of change is that this fund can make a difference by allowing more risk to happen because there's a guarantee that will pay back the debt if in fact there's a default. So you can look at the fund and you could say, ultimately, did we get more money to the communities that are usually not considered to be worthy of getting money? You can be at the social enterprise level so that the businesses that are growing to be impact businesses with a purposeful business mission. Traditionally, it's been nonprofits, but now we see many social enterprises be profit-driven companies that say we will also have impact. And many nonprofits are developing their own impact arm that is for profit. And it's very important that they have a theory of change as well, so that there can be alignment between the fund's theory of change and the investee's theory of change. And the theory of change can actually be directed at what changes happen for the people, the community, the customers. So there's all these different levels of what can be included in the theory of change. The ultimate question that I like to ask is who or what changes? Is this impact investment trying to change a sector like the funds? Is it trying to change the way that the businesses operate? Is it trying to change the circumstances of customers and people? So theory of change is very common, and evaluators have a really important role in helping to do theory of change. On the fund that I'm evaluating, it took me about 6 months interviewing everybody involved about what they thought their theory of change was. And at the end, the people on the committee, there were 14 investors, said they had never seen a theory of change that was so easy to understand, and it represented their position. And that means that the kind of evaluative thinking evaluators bring usually is more detailed and more disciplined than might otherwise happen if the evaluators aren't in the scene. So again, where do you evaluate? What's the target of evaluation? It can be at the level of the company. It can be the level of norms and practices. So for instance, the level of the company, like how well is the company treating its employees and customers? What effect is it having? It can be about an industry. For instance, the MacArthur Foundation in the US is actually doing catalytic investing right now. They're trying to make a change in how the impact investing industry is actually operating. It can be at the level of the region, households, and regulations. What is the governance? What is the level of effect on income? Or it can be at an ecosystem. Are you actually shoring up the supply chain? It's one thing for a social enterprise to create a product, but what if they can't get that product to market? And so what is the gaps in an ecosystem? Or it could be that you believe you're investing in a good company, but they're actually not monitoring the vendors that are supplying the supplies to them. So there's all these different places, and Veronica and I know evaluators who are working at every one of these levels, and we know a lot of these levels are getting evaluated by non-evaluators as well, and it's a different flavor. Veronica, is this did you want to go at this one, or did you want me to?
Why don't I start, and then you can add, Jane, because I
Okay.
know you had a couple of categories you wanted to add. So, so now you're starting to see, okay, well, some of the usual go-to tools and approaches that evaluators have in their toolkit are applicable. So another learning that Jane and I have made or have come to after our various different engagements with either supporting this work, studying this work, investing in this work, or evaluating this work, has been that that when you apply our tools is really critical. It's not as simple as you know, what we say in the evaluation space. You have a formative evaluation, which happens before an intervention finishes, and then you have a summative evaluation, which talks to you a little bit about what has happened. It's not as simple as these two moments in time. It's a little bit more like a developmental evaluation approach, where you are working to try to assess the results as well as adapt a program as it's emerging through like an innovation. But even more so, we in the evaluation space have always said things like, if only we could have been there earlier. And so if you're coming at the end and there's no theory of change in your regular evaluation practice, you would be reconstructing a theory of change. If you are coming in the middle and you're doing monitoring, you're hopefully leveraging some of the data that exists, but it's probably poor quality because nobody else has been mining the data. And so, so in impact investing, because so much work happens at the front end, at the beginning, before the investment is made, it's really, really important to be thinking about evaluation and impact measurement and management, IMM, even before the funds are actually invested. And so we call that the due diligence phase, when you're actually doing the research to make the choice of how to invest or where to invest or when to invest. It's actually quite useful to have some type of evaluative thinking positioned to help shape some of that. And so aligning to the investment life cycle has been actually quite key in getting to or increasing the probability that you are all going to be able to measure and assess the impact of your work moving forward. And so evaluators can support investors across the entire life cycle. But in the beginning, as Jane mentioned, the theory of change happens, would be really important to happen before the investment is released. And if we do a compare and a contrast between what is called social impact measurement and what is called evaluation, we see that there's actually a lot of commonality. And so in the impact thesis phase, that's happening early. And then in the investor partner relations phase, you know, you're making relationships and you're kind of what in the investor sector we say, we're making deals. We're making deals. It would be really helpful to be using things like framing our impact or agreeing to some of our impact metrics together. And so that evaluation could be useful there too. In even thinking about how you're going to be sourcing your deals, where you're going, or in terms of your pipeline development, like when you're planning what investments will go into a particular fund, for example, it would be really helpful to be thinking about your evaluation pieces, because you need data in order to be able to make the case or make a decision around that. In screening, we talked about it earlier on across the spectrum. How do you know something actually has positive or negative impacts? When you're screening for these types of things, some of the analytical tools that we use in terms of research and evidence generation could be useful there as well, and so on and so forth. So there's many ways that evaluation and what we call social impact measurement really are actually one and the same. And it's applicable across the various different points in time when you're making decisions. And I think as an investor, that has been one of the most important pieces to what we often say is evidence-based decision-making. Being able to align the evidence or what it is that you need with a decision point really does help set you up for success once you make the investment. And then, of course, then you make the investment and you start to collect data and you start to manage your impact. And another key, I would say, idea, and it's called an idea because often when I say this, it's like this aha moment, that we have in the impact investing space is that you manage your finance. You would never question that you need an accountant. You would never question that you need someone to actually, a tool, a system, an MIS system to manage the currency, to manage the transactions of your financial system. And so when you think about impact investing, you should actually be investing or dedicating as much time to managing the impact piece alongside your financial management system. These are not types of approaches and systems that should happen separately. In fact, in certain scenarios, as we all know, actually managing the impact is even more difficult than managing your finance. So you have to be really diligent and on top of it. And that is a concept that I have to say, not all investors really embrace or think or believe, which is why oftentimes we end up in this impact washing conversation. And so I'm going to hand it back over to you, Jane, to add to this particular content.
Yeah, what Veronica and I really love about this framework is that part of what evaluation has done in the past is focus so much on what changes happen after grants are made, after money is given out, after work is happening. And you'll see in this chart how much of the attention happens before money is actually invested. And so we are appreciating how much evaluators can be part of these early stages about the thesis and about the relations. Sometimes investors come together and they don't even agree on what level of risk they want or what level of impact they want. And they need to manage expectations, and evaluators can be part of that. And then even just, I'm working, as I said before, with a fund that has one person who does the deal sourcing and the deal screening and figuring out whether or not to make an investment. That's one person. There's not a set of criteria that's standardized that person uses. And so it's very subjective. And there's a lot of evaluation opportunity in what is the criteria you're using. So for instance, in the fund I'm saying, they're trying to promote racial equity, but many of the deals that have been made are going to organizations that are primarily run by white people. So what do they mean by racial equity then? So there's a lot of those questions that evaluators can ask. And so we have roles throughout, but as Veronica said, this piece here about data collection aggregation may be using the data for evidence. Tracking external factors is where evaluators have spent most of their time with our clients and with our internal organizations that we evaluate. All of this part here is where most of the time is spent in the impact investing space. Once they make the deal, the impact monitoring normally slows down. And so we need to be real involved early on as well. We have terrific roles to play. And then there's also our tools apply at this further end.
Jane, before we move on, there's a question.
Okay.
And so I'm gonna ask it of you, and then I will add on if necessary. And so the question by Patrick is, does the evaluator function both as an assessor, collecting and analyzing data, and as a consultant advisor, helping the investor project to benefit from the analysis?
That's a fabulous question. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that are coming through that we're going to return to questions in just a few minutes, and Natalia will help us organize some of the questions, but that is a great question. In our experience, we are usually involved throughout the process, the evaluation. Those investors who have actually wanted to build a strong, more robust system will actually bring the evaluators in at the data collection level, as well as helping to advise how to use the data to actually modify things. In fact, Veronica talked before about developmental evaluation happening in this space. I wish I could say it's widespread. It's not, but it's one of the most exciting and promising places because the evaluator partners with the impact investing fund to help them learn as they go along about the impact piece of this. So I'd say the answer is yes, ideally, but it may be that they contract out the data collection, or they just may expect the social enterprise to provide it to them, or they may just collect it themselves. So if anything, it varies from one fund to the other, but there's many examples where the answer is yes.
And I will add, as I'm going to put on my evaluator hat now and take off my investor hat. So I am an internal evaluator to my impact investing team. And so I help them with all of the, I would say, all of these steps, basically all of them until data collection and aggregation. And at some level, I work with them to be able to set up these systems that will then collect the data that the investees will be reporting. And I make sure that they're of high quality. I make sure it's aligned to the IMP, the Impact Management Project's 5 Dimensions, which is the framework that we use. And I make sure that we're able to analyze the data. However, we then have, and we'll talk a little bit about this, we then have agreed that every 2 to 3 years, we will look at the fund and we'll contract out an independent assessor. It could be an independent evaluator. It could be an independent assurance process that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides to actually then look. And so what I'm doing is I'm assuring the quality of the setup, of the impact framing, of the relationships and the partnerships component. I even help our investees negotiate with other investors, because something that's really different about the way this works is that many of the investors are at the same table, and we know that we're optimizing for financial returns, and we know that if we keep adding more impact metrics to the list, we'll probably decrease the probability that there will be mission drift and that the company or the enterprise will not be able to achieve both, because we know that this is hard. So we harmonize and agree in a way that I haven't actually seen in the more traditional government sector ways. So as an internal evaluator, I'm not part of the team. I'm actually part of the foundation, but I'm working with them to be able to assure the quality of the work that we're doing. However, that does not take the place of then commissioning out an independent assessment to validate and verify if that is in fact happening. And so just to go back to Jane's point that it's an and it's both. And I think that that's what makes for a robust impact investing evaluation practice, Not all investors are this way. Many investors actually don't have an internal, I would say like expert, but rather just commission completely outside and are hiring portfolio managers to help do this work better. And the portfolio manager is doing things like attending evaluation trainings and becoming a member of our local VOPE, which is the American Evaluation Association, and really trying to ramp up to bring these worlds together. And that I think would be the ideal scenario, but there's just not enough demand just yet, even though it's bigger. And so I would say that in the meantime, if you are an evaluator and you're interested in working in the impact investing space, your options are about getting hired by an investor or becoming an independent, but still becoming comfortable with some of the language and the approaches and the ways that the impact investing space works.
Yeah, I wanted to say one more thing on this one, because one thing that's not in this question, Patrick, but I believe is like one of the things I see most commonly is as an independent consultant, I've responded to requests and have participated in at least 3 or 4 opportunities where you get hired to create the system, and then they want to take over and do that independently. But actually developing the design and the measurement system itself is a very big part of the market right now for evaluators, because people don't even know, as you saw those confusing slides, like what are my options and what's the trade-offs between option 1 or option 2. So that's a very big part of where people are at, is like, what should my system even look like? And then whether or not they actually pay for help after they develop their system is another question. Yeah. Should we move on?
Jane, did you want to say anything about what might be missing from that investment lifecycle slide?
Remind me what we're referring to, Veronica.
Network analysis. There was a couple of other processes that you were thinking about.
Yeah. Okay, so this is like this is another front where evaluators could actually be engaged. That isn't really part of the conversation now, but it's our opportunity to bring some of our tools to the picture, and it's emergent. And that is that a lot of the tools that we have as evaluators are things like network analysis or outcome harvesting or contribution analysis. Everybody always wants to know about causality, and they think it's too hard to know whether their investment is making a difference. And we know that not any one single program makes all the difference, but there are many tools that we can use. So for instance, network analysis has been used by USAID to actually show the strength in the supply chain and all of the ecosystem around impact investing in a particular sector. So let's say it's an agricultural product. Are there stronger relationships between the growers and the distributors and getting it to market? So that is an example of where network analysis may be extremely important. Or in the fund that I'm working on, people have difficulty getting conventional finance. So does the work that they're doing strengthen their ties to commercial lenders? And is there stronger ties between the groups that are actually asking for the money and the groups that are deploying the money? So network analysis can be extremely important, as can contribution analysis or outcome harvesting after activities take place, to be able to use these new methodologies in order to show what happened that would not have happened otherwise. In finance, additionality is really an important concept. What are you adding that would not have happened otherwise? People use the term, but for our investment, but for this. So the outcome harvesting or the contribution analysis are ways to trace what difference your investments made or the investors' investments made to change people's lives, to change the way that social enterprises are growing. And these are some new methodologies that are being introduced to the impact investing space, but yet we have a long way to go before these become considered to be part of the process, part of which is that there's not a lot of incentives to do strong data analysis right now. It would come out of profit, and we're talking about capital markets. And there is not a performance bonus for having stronger impact. There is performance bonus for having more financial return, but until we start seeing that the system is rewarding their program staff for actually having more impact, we're going to have a little bit of a gap between using these really strong methods and actually seeing them employed in the impact investing space. But we think that we've got some tools that could be extremely helpful to actually verify impact. So that's one thing we wanted to add. I'm going to move to the next slide now so that we can give you some time for some more questions. Just going back to what are some of the more emergent topics. This is a topic that's near and dear to the heart of so many evaluators who would not even imagine evaluating a subject without talking to the people who are most affected. But in the world of capital markets, the main stakeholder has always been considered to be the investors, the people who have money at stake. And unfortunately, the people whose lives are affected, stakeholders, the customers, the employees, the communities who are affected by economic activities have not had the same level of relevance. And that is starting to change because some of the standards that we shared with you before, some of the principles we shared with you before are saying one cannot claim to have impact if you do not talk to the key end users, who are the people that the impact is impacting. And unless you bring them into the analysis, you cannot say we have had so much impact and therefore put more money into my fund. You know, whether it's an institutional investor or an individual investor, the claim for impact needs to be verified in part with the people who are most affected actually helping define what kind of impact they want in the first place, and then being part of providing feedback on, are they getting what they need out of a service or product? And then potentially talking about how is their community changing or how is their household changing? So that is a really important topic. And one of the interesting facts is that the impact verification firm called Bluemark just put out a report that showed progress that's being made in impact investing. And the least amount of progress has been happening in involving the stakeholder. So that's shining the light on how this is a big gap and it's becoming a topic of greater focus. I'm part of a big OECD project that is asking how can you do stakeholder engagement better in impact measurement and management. And we have a website, I'll put that into the chat box afterwards, that shows lots of examples of how it's happening in impact measurement and management. So I'm going to move to the next slide, which Veronica has spoken to a bit, but this is the other piece where evaluators really have a role to play. And it is actually being built out by the accounting companies primarily and the finance companies, which is the verification and assurance. And this is to say, people have their financial books and they get verified through audits. But what about your impact books? What about your impact process? So a big watershed moment was when the IFC operating principles put that down as one principle, that the way that you align with impact measurement and management needs to be verified. And there's a growing business in verification. It's really kind of a big open green field that the big accounting firms are moving into and many independent firms are moving into, that's trying to set up verification processes and standards. And verification and assurance are sometimes used interchangeably. They have different meanings. For instance, the UN SDG impact standards are requiring assurance that you are verifying your results. And that means an outside third party is actually going in and looking at your processes and in some cases, your data. There's more focus right now on processes than data, but at least if those processes are in place, you know that there is more integrity than if in fact there is no verification at all. So these are two really big topics that are huge opportunities for evaluators to be influencing. Did you want to add anything to that, Veronica, or should we move on?
I'll just add, so that's what I was referring to, where we are actually investors of Bluemark, and also utilizing Bluemark to be able to demonstrate what good could look like, because right now the field is dominated by the big four audit companies, and you know, as we know, audit companies look at numbers. Evaluators engage with people. And so we want to make sure that the way that this market around disclosure, which was the last pillar of the 4 pillars that we showed earlier, that this market actually emerges so that it is building off of the best thinking that has emerged from evaluation and through the financial assurance markets. And so we're really excited about this, this space. And so we're contributing to it as field builders, but in addition to that, we're actually assuring some of our own funds and learning a lot about the differences between process assurance, which would be like process evaluation, and impact assurance or performance assurance, which would be more about the results. And it's interesting to be part of that process, because the stakeholder engagement is definitely not something that logically flows in a performance or an impact assurance process. And so that certainly does confirm what Jane is speaking to, which is it's a gap. And I think part of the reason that it's a gap is because that means cost. Someone would have to go to the field and talk to people. Someone would have to travel somewhere. How many people is enough? And it would surface all of the questions as evaluators we often contend to in terms of trade-offs, in terms of sample size, in terms of who we speak to. But I do appreciate that we're revisiting that concept, because perhaps something new and different will come from it that isn't just about speaking to participants, but really trying to disrupt the way that capital is moving through the system. So
Okay.
I think we've reached.
I think we're just going to bring it to the end here and just say we can play an important role. Evaluators have been on the sidelines. This field has grown up without the evaluators having a major role. And I think that when we enter the scene, there is so much appreciation for the kinds of thinking and skills that we have, as long as we bring respect for how finance thinks and works and operates, and not come with all the answers, but come as a learning partner. So we need to play a role in deepening the knowledge about impact investing processes, developments, and challenges. We really need to, we can actually help bring that out and help understand the field more. We can translate between evaluative thinking and methods to the measurement needs, because some of the things like stakeholder engagement is not something that, as Veronica just said, has been in the processes up to this point. And there's like 2 levels. One is there's field building. This is a growing field, and I'm glad to see all of you here. We just had a meeting yesterday of the American Evaluation Association, social impact measurement group. And it was amazing to have so many people. There was, there's 200 members, and there was close to over 50 people talking about how evaluators are working in this space now. So we can be working in this space as evaluators, but we also can be contributing, sitting at the tables, building out what this field looks like and helping create the standards. And we are usually welcome at those tables because our perspective has been built over 70 years of practicing as a profession. So Veronica, do you want to wrap up anything else before we go to questions here?
Nope, I think you did it. I think we've talked long enough. So really turning over to you for any questions. I know that there was a lot of words that have been shared today, perhaps new concepts, perhaps old concepts with a new perspective on it. And so this is your opportunity to ask your questions. And I think, Natalia, you'll help facilitate that piece as well, correct?
Natalia, thank you, Veronica and Jane. Yeah, I'm coming. Коллеги, пришло время вопросов. Вы можете поднять руку или просто включить микрофон и задать нам. Jane and Veronica, please turn on to English channel. So if there are questions in Russian, then Vladimir would be able to help. Коллеги, вопросы ваши, пожалуйста. Анна, не хотите задать свой вопрос, который мы обсуждали с вами сегодня на сессии нашей с утра? Коллеги, ваши вопросы. Анна ушла.
So there's a question in the chat.
Yes.
So Patrick is asking Jane, because I don't know if you can, oh, you can see the chat
yes,
now.
yes, Patrick, the IMM landscape we showed is absolutely global. The one thing beautiful about this impact measurement and management field is that the groups that are developing these standards are doing this on a global level. It wouldn't be surprising to you to know that most of the money is coming from the global north, and that the global south is a beneficiary of much of the money, so that all of the parts of the globe need to be involved in this development of the field. And the IRIS Plus system is part of the Global Impact Investing Network. The United Nations standards is a global standard. The impact management projects involve, global actors. So yes, everything we're showing you about the landscape is consensus based on a global outlook. Yes.
And I'll just add that we have, Jane and myself separately or together, have actually been invited to speak on this particular topic for the Chinese market, for the India market, in Japan. And so just over like the last year or two. And so I would say that it's not just that these tools are global in nature, but the market is shifting so that different types of investors from different places are asking these questions, which is why it was so nice that your team asked us to come speak to your part of the world. I think Anna had a question. She unmuted earlier.
Инна, у вас был вопрос? Инна Шишова. Задайте голосом тогда. Так, где? Инна.
And if you're talking, you're on mute.
Oh, no. Инна, у вас вопрос был?
Я могу?
Да, Ольга Анатольевна, пожалуйста.
Я прошу прощения, у меня вот вопрос суждений, если можно. Вы знаете, я вот сейчас слушала, большое-большое вам спасибо, очень интересно. Вот этот вот водораздел между... Я по-русски, да, могу говорить или по-английски? Да?
Jane, you hear the interpretation, right? Just nod. Yeah, говорите, Ольга Анатольевна.
Этот водораздел, как бы, с одной стороны, между оценщиками, как я понимаю, или между полем, где работают профессиональные оценщики, и между, я не знаю, там, специальностью или полем, где сосредоточены вот эти, ну, не знаю, аналитики, наверное, да, можно так, наверное, их назвать. Вот, мне кажется, для нас...
Impact analysts, directors of impact is a new title. Directors of Impact.
Мне кажется, вот такой, как бы, не знаю, опять вопрос суждения. Дело в том, что вот на нашей российской почве вот это направление Impact Investing, я так по-английски скажу, оно настолько в таком как бы зачаточном состоянии находится, и они как раз эти как бы наши, да, инвесторы, они не владеют этим инструментарием и вот этими стандартами всеми бесконечными. И мне кажется, наши российские инвесторы, они, наверное, вот этот вот водораздел и не чувствуют, и не знают, и, может быть, у нас нет необходимости так отстраиваться от них, или наоборот, они не настолько отстроены от нас, не так далеко стоят, как от оценщиков, чтобы вот этот водораздел почувствовать. Я не уверена, что я сейчас как бы достаточно точно выражаю мысль, но мне кажется, они больше как бы склонны прислушиваться к оценщикам, потому что у них нет этой экспертизы, нет этого инструментария богатого, что был доступен, возможно, вот вашим коллегам, вашим инвесторам. И, собственно говоря, вот это вот все там 33 стандарта, которые вы показывали, вот этого всего у нас нету. И как раз-таки они к нам приходят без этого, без этого инструментария, и у нас здесь вот этого, может быть, необходимости такой, не знаю, нету. Или пока нету. Не знаю. Немножко искусственно, может быть, не знаю.
Well, that's very, very interesting. And I think I just want to make one comment about those tools is that the measurement of impact, and this is where impact washing really, really matters. The measurement of impact was really very, very light as it was growing in Western Europe, as it was growing in the US, as it was growing in some of these centers of capital. And that in fact, these are really within the last 5 years that so many of these have been growing. And as evaluators in Russia, becoming familiar with these tools and aligning with these tools would be extremely useful so that you can bridge the gap, because investments may happen in Russia, or they could be happening in the global South, or being there. If there's more of a commonality and alignment among the methods, evaluators can be more relevant to the conversation, understanding how it is starting to grow at a global level. Veronica, did you want to add something to that?
I did, and I say how lucky you are, because I've also heard from in the Chinese market where we did a similar session, and I think we had something like 10,000 people watching, like something very large. But I think if you don't have the barriers that we have observed in the US and in European markets, I think that that puts you in a really good position of being able to prevent impact washing and to start from a position of something that's more robust. We're just arriving there now. And I would say that as everything in the US, there's so much diversity. And so part of our challenge is getting everybody on the same table. But when we have these conversations about philanthropy, it's very similar. Philanthropy has a lot of barriers, but what we see in other places, philanthropy and evaluation is a little bit more connected. So my suggestion would be to just build from the standard and then make and then design it so that it works for your particular market. I think we have time for one more question, and I feel like Ina, maybe you unmuted before.
Инна, давайте ваш вопрос.
Да, ну вот я, в общем, как бы смыкаюсь мыслью с Ольгой, и я поняла так для себя, что вот этот вот разрыв, да, вот этот вот раздел, он, собственно, наверное, причина у него это вот состояние, скажем так, финансового сектора, финансового рынка, отношений инвесторов и, в общем, развитости, и, наверное, включение в глобальный контекст финансового рынка. И чем как бы более национальный финансовый рынок инкорпорирован в глобальный контекст, тем, соответственно, больше вот этот гэп. Ну, я поняла это так, верно? Получается, что глобальный финансовый рынок, когда развитый он, соответственно, они приходят там со своим инструментарием, со своими представлениями о прекрасном, и поэтому здесь трудно договориться. И мы в этом отношении, конечно, да, наверное, в уникальной ситуации, наверное, действительно повезло, что у нас вот. Но видите, опять же, наш финансовый рынок серьезно ориентирован на глобальные, именно в части социальных и импакт-инвестиций, зеленых инвестиций на глобальные рынки. И поэтому я думаю, что мы, наверное, будем наблюдать, вот когда этот разрыв будет, наоборот, увеличиваться у нас на глазах. И наша задача, видимо, как оценщиков, получается, его поймать, что ли, вот пока он еще, ну, как бы...
Да, пока их еще плохому не научили.
Потому, да. Я во всяком случае так вас поняла. Все верно, так?
Let me just say one thing, which is I absolutely agree. And I would say that part of what we've seen in the impact investing space is because we felt the emergence of it, right? And with any new tool, any new, like we see it with social impact bonds, development impact bonds, green bonds. There's a lot of chaos in it. And hopefully you're joining a little bit later in that curve. And so you get to leapfrog over those challenges that we experienced. And I would agree with you 100%, Ina, that this is a good opportunity to normalize before someone else gets to normalize what good impact measurement practice looks like. Jane, over to you for any final comments.
Okay, can we take one more question? Sorry, I know we are kind of, but one more is okay?
Let's do that, yeah.
Владимир, давайте. Володь, микрофон.
Да, микрофон я включаю. Я просто не слышу, что мне дают слово. Вообще, спасибо за выступление. Ну, я считаю, у меня тут есть тоска в ходе конференции таким к методологическим разговорам. Я считаю, что эта сессия одна из вообще таких, ну, самых сильных на сегодняшний момент в нашей конференции. Жаль, что она, ну, так вечером проходит. Для России это немного неудобное время. И жаль, что мало участвует. Но у меня вопрос такой. А есть ли какие-то работы, ну, исследовательские работы, в первую очередь, в которых описывается greenwashing и impact-washing? И есть ли, ну, может быть, какие-то описания, как бы, критериев или признаков такого инвестирования?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's definitely a lot in the press right now about impact washing on the ESG side, on the environmental, social, and governance side. And we can throw some link. We could send some links to Natalia and maybe share that way. The impact washing in general, though, has been the critiques of, if you say I have an intention for impact, that is all you need to do in order to make the claims. And if you look at any impact report that a company puts out, you will see that they do not talk about people's lives. So really, pretty much, you could see that everywhere when you look at the company reports. But Veronica and I will look for some resources to share your way, because that's a fabulous question. And let's just say any impact report that doesn't include stakeholders would be by definition impact washing, because we do not know, except from the point of view of the impact investor, if they made a difference. I did put into the website, the chat box, the website about our global stakeholder engagement process that shows examples from many different countries. There are 13 countries that were involved in how they're doing stakeholder engagement to prevent impact washing. So Veronica, do you have anything specific you want to say about that, or do you want to, yeah.
The only thing that I'll add is that, Vladimir, we just hosted at the American Evaluation Association an hour-long session last week on impact washing specifically. And we had a woman who, as part of the Harvard group, had been studying impact washing. She wrote a paper on it that we could share. And then we also had a speaker from Bluemark who talked about impact washing as well. And so maybe what we can do is also share the recording, Jane, with this particular group.
That's a great idea.
I moderated, but I didn't say that much. Thank you very much. I think we've reached the end. Back to you, Natalie, to wrap us up.
Okay, I think we should wrap up, and let me, on behalf of the Russian Evaluation Association, express our deep gratitude for joining us in this conversation today, for your support and your charity. And I think hopefully this will be the beginning of the conversation, and maybe we can continue it at some other conferences. Thanks again, and with this we can wrap the session. Коллеги, я думаю, на этом мы можем завершить сессию, и ждем всех завтра на конференции продолжать эти наши обсуждения.